Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression and its impact on different regions. Hey Ruben, want to get us started?
All right, cool. My name is Ruben, and I'll be talking to you about the American Great Depression between the years of 1929 up until 1939. So, just to recap a little background information, the Great Depression began a few years after World War I had ended during an agreement at the Treaty of Versailles. So I hope we remember that. The outcome of that treaty basically meant that Germany was required to pay $33 billion in war reparations back to Great Britain and France. Um, so you can imagine Germany decided, you know what, let me take some money from American banks. They seem cool. So Germany decided, let's borrow money, from US banks in order to make back or pay back the war reparations or payments to Great Britain and France. So before all of this mess, France and Great Britain had already owned the US money from World War One, and they had slowly started using some of the money received from Germany from those exact reparations that Germany took from US in order to pay back the US. So I hope you see the problem there with how that whole circle is working out. So you can imagine that hurt the economy. It hurt the economy. So the impact on the American economy by this point, a lot of Americans were in debt. Especially the agricultural business, because during the time of World War One, etc., the industrial weapons manufacturing, things like that, were considered more important at the time. So, as wages and crop prices were extremely lower than even the averages in the during the war, taxes and goods were beginning to rise. So this is a problem for the American people. They have the problem being that taxes and prices for goods are beginning to rise, and then you're telling me I have to pay back loans, because a lot of Americans are in debt. So people had trouble paying back banks versus providing for their families. So you can imagine a lot of people defaulted on their payments, and the effect of that, 25,000 banks filed for bankruptcy. They failed. A lack of faith in banking. People did not see any real worth or value in even trusting the bank, and they stopped investing. So you can imagine that brings us to the Wall Street crash. On October 24th, 1929, stock prices began to drop. The speculative bubble, which means that people basically, like, the belief that something will do well, it burst. It just blew up. People stopped believing in this speculative thing. So the market had lost more than $30 billion. 90,000 businesses failed because of it. 25% of the US labor force was unemployed by 1933, and the farm income fell from 13.9 billion in 1929 to 7.1 billion in 1933. And who became responsible? President Herbert Hoover, the president of the United States, was blamed for all of this. So you can imagine Hoover was pretty blindsided. I mean, he was aware, but he was starting to panic. He was starting to, okay, you know what? It's just a momentary setback. We'll sleep about it. It's a thing of tomorrow. So he insisted for voluntary cooperation. Basically, he told business leaders to continue maintaining wages and keep the same hours of level of production. And the public hearing this, they're thinking this dude's crazy, and he lost a lot of support. From the American public. People viewed him pretty negatively. Example, one of the events you should be aware of is the Bonus March. Cool. So, boom, here comes FDR, the New Deal. Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR. He is the guy that everybody likes. So, after Hoover lost the presidential election in 1932, FDR immediately began pushing legislation through Congress. So what does that consist of? Relief, recovery, and reform. The first 100 days of office. Some acts you should know is the Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the Federal Emergency Relief Administration.
The American Great Depression really was very devastating. Now let's see, was Canada any better? Okay, now what caused Canada's Great Depression? First of all, Canada had a pretty weak industry since their economy was mainly based on agriculture and producing raw materials, unlike America with all their consumer businesses and factories after World War I. The second cause was the Harvey Smoot tariff, which was from the US. This tariff significantly decreased international trade, leading to significant losses for Canadian industries. And other small factors that contributed to this was overproduction and a wealth gap. However, since Canada had limited international investment, there wasn't like a giant stock market crash like in the US. So overall, Canada had like very similar problems as the US, such as unemployment, leading to significantly decreased wages. And surprisingly, Canada was second behind the US in unemployment stats, and production decreased long-term wise. The prairie provinces, which were the agricultural regions of Canada, were hit especially hard, such as Alberta, leading to significantly decreased crop prices. Decreased crop prices mean unhappy farmers, so people just migrate away from their farms. The leader during this time was Mackenzie King, and he was a totally liberal leader, meaning he strongly believed in laissez-faire policies, similarly to Hoover and like other conservative presidents during the US Great Depression. So he basically believed the entire depression didn't exist and it was just a symptom, so he ignored the whole situation, meaning provinces had to come up with their own funding from church groups and local charities. Out of nowhere, the 1930s election comes sneaking around, and Bennett, who was King's competitor, won. However, he was conservative, yet he won because he promised a lot of policies that will help the people. He passed the 1931 Unemployment Relief Act, which required local governments to contribute 50% of the funding to provinces. But this wasn't enough, so some provinces just declared bankruptcy. On top of all the trouble, he passed the 50% tariff to protect Canadian industries. However, this led to even more decreased export. One of the reasons which he didn't help that quickly is because he feared unions, as he believed it was linked to communism. Since he believed this way, he created the 1932 relief camps, which were run by the military to perform public works for a low pay, and since this was not popular, it led to the 1935 strikes, and relief workers decided to create the Workers' Unity League, but Bennett just ignored them. They went on a march, which was called On to Ottawa, to protest, and Bennett still ignored and sent in the cops instead. So, since the 1935 election was coming up, Bennett passed the 1935 Canadian New Deal, which was a limited version of FDR's New Deal, which basically expanded more power to the Canadian government, allowing it to oversee agriculture, actually control prices, and maybe some proposed relief for businesses, but with a lot of red tape. However, this policy had a major disadvantage as it split the Conservative Party votes, meaning it guaranteed a victory for King. So since King basically won the election, he didn't do anything, no reforms, nothing. And he ruled Bennett's New Deal unconstitutional on the basis that the Great Depression was not a national emergency. So he actually later does something because it was pretty bad. And the first thing he did was the 1935 Loan Council, which was a policy that allowed the Canadian government to give loans to each provinces. But yeah, loans, just like student loans, you gotta pay interest and you eventually have to pay it back. So Alberta decided to just default on their payments because they were really broke. So King later proposed the National Unemployment Insurance, and this led to a lot of resistance from provinces, especially richer provinces such as Ontario and Quebec, as they didn't want to pay for those rural Alberta loans. And yeah, what were the long-term effects of Bennett's and King's policy? So since they didn't do any reform, they just waited the depression out. And later, their economy became better because during the start of World War II, which led to increased trade with Europe and the US. Let's go into the Argentine Great Depression by Lance.
Now we're going to be talking about the Argentine Great Depression. And so at the start of the Depression, Argentina was actually in a really comfortable position. They had the fourth highest GDP in 1929 and also had the strongest economy in South America. However, their fall would come in the fact that they were focused on an export market. And since it was around this market, global trade crashes could then result in a great detriment to the Argentine market, and was shown in the Great Depression, as beef and wheat dropped 40% and their whole GDP dropped 25%. The infamous decade is another factor that led to the Great Depression, or that was affected by the Great Depression. In 1930, a military coup removed Irigoyen, which led to Jose Iriburu to take over. And while in power, Iriburu persecuted far-left groups with over 2,000 illegal executions, which allowed him to propose changes to the constitution that introduced corporatism. And as opposition grew, this led to the development of the Concordancia and Agustin Justo becoming president in the 1932 election. And now the Concordancia was made up of three groups: the UCR, which opposed Irigoyen, the National Democratic Party, and the Independent Socialist Party. And this group controlled Argentina throughout the 1930s by things such as corruption and fraud, censorships, and basically overthrew a corrupt government to be corrupt. And so now we get into the Great Depression. In 1933, there was a Roca-Runciman agreement with Great Britain, which guaranteed meat market and eliminated tariffs on Argentine cereals at the expense of protecting British commercial interests. There was public work projects, including building 32,000 miles of highway, and an import substitution industrialization, which strayed away from foreign trade and instead wanted to improve on domestic production. And through these acts, the economy then began to stabilize by 1935. And then there is the end of the Concordancia, which is shown through increased urbanization and employment, and as a result of the neutrality of Argentina during World War II, which affected trade with both the Axis and Allied powers. And as a result of these actions, opposition grew, which then led to the final coup in 1943, which ended the Concordancia.
Thank you, Lance. Overall, the Great Depression really started from the United States and trickled into other regions that had their economies connected to the US, and everything just turned sour, causing unemployment, money problems, and housing problems. Well, good luck on your exams. See your faces next time.